Scared. Recording in progress. Heck yeah.
How you doing?
And it's recording. So that's good.
How you doing?
Good, how are you?
I haven't seen you in a while.
How have you been?
Yeah. You haven't had a semester.
Yeah, not bad.
Yeah.
Making it.
You're not a semester.
No, I'm in training.
So you're not working.
No. It'll be scary time next year.
You won't be scared.
Oh,
It'll be fun.
it is scary.
I guess
I'm in the middle of it right now.
It's been a while since I did one.
Very scary.
What was yours about? Do you remember?
Yeah. I did two. I did one in English on Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. That book. Big ass book. Takes place 1940 to 1945. And it's set in Germany. It's about a character who was subject of psychological experiments.
Oh.
He can sense in his body when rockets are going to go off. And so the Germans want it. So they can figure out when the Brits are going to bomb. And there's like 700 characters. It's in like a bunch of languages. It's crazy. But, it's metafiction. So it's like fiction about fiction. And super crazy. But I use theories to interpret it. And then I wrote a thesis on truth by virtue of meaning. So statements that are true by virtue of
Like
meaning.
what?
Like all bachelors are unmarried.
Okay.
Is that true? By virtue of the meaning alone? Some people think yes, because all you have words, but what about priests? Or what about, right? Like,
Right.
what about, there's all sorts of questions you can ask about it. to kind of challenge it.
Loophole questions.
Yeah. Yeah. They're both tough, but good.
And those were for your undergrad?
That was for undergrad, yeah. Dissertation is about like self-consciousness, origins of self-consciousness. What?
Consciousness.
It is, it's hard. But I wrote about a lot. Together.
Yeah.
Which is in the chapter. I just read.
Yeah.
Joint perception. How like that evolved. So I was really interested in how to experience the world together. How that forms.
Do you think some animals are more conscious than other animals?
Animals have consciousness. I think animals have different kinds of consciousness. Different types of species.
I think I agree.
I'm super influenced by so since different species have different bodies, different ways they're
So Dow, how do you say his name? Dow.
McDowell?
McDowell.
Yeah.
He doesn't believe that. And so first of all, he thinks infants are well, they're like human animals, but they're like mostly related to.
Well, like I said, the stuff that's in the book kind of concerned with some
Yeah.
of the pieces that he has, but
He doesn't think infants can have experiences.
well, experiences, if you think about experiences as like experiences as we went to the movies and we had such a great experience. Like watching Star Wars together,
Yeah.
right? Like when we use the term experience in that sense, and it's definitely something that we're talking about, making explicit for ourselves, sharing the scenes. Like, why did you enjoy it? Here's why. Probably reasons, but
Yeah. Right.
it might say something like, it looked at the screen for a while and it made some sense. But we wouldn't say, oh, we had a really good time together.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which infants don't possess that. So it's easier.
Do you have kids?
Yes,
How
I have
many?
one.
One?
Yep.
How old are they?
He's 12. He just turned 12 last week on my
It's a
birthday.
rough age to be.
You guys have the same birthday?
Yeah, we have some
Oh,
birthday.
that's good.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. But yeah, like raising him, I learned a lot about, it wasn't like an experiment or anything, but we definitely taught each other things about how to attend to things together. I thought a lot about my research when I was raising him. Sure.
Does he think philosophy is cool or is
He does.
it dad's thing?
No, he thinks it's cool.
That's good.
I think because his mom is always like, here's something you can talk to dad about. And I do the same with her. She's an artist. So,
Oh, like a visual artist?
yeah. Yeah, so we definitely have conversations about stuff. We don't seriously ask him questions about it. Yeah, it's totally.
It'll be a genius project.
He's real smart.
Well, thinking about things that deep at such an early age. I think all I thought about was potato chips and SpongeBob, you
He thinks a lot about TikTok,
know?
but he also really likes the classics. Like if you ask him, what are you gonna talk about with him? It's
He read Percy Jackson?
yes,
Oh, I just walked in. How old is he?
he's 12.
Oh, nice. Perfect age. My little brother is just in his Percy Jackson Halloween.
Yeah,
I love the books.
he's really into that. Yeah, and listens to the Audible, all those books. Yeah, but yeah, we also like to sit around and read about.
Oh,
Is that my throne?
Yes. that's your
Oh,
throne.
how nice.
You need just.
Be clear, this is the religious
Okay.
discussion. This is the Alice Hall.
You are here.
Cool,
You
awesome.
made
I'm
it.
just making sure. I thought it was in Flossin for some reason. So I was just wandering around.
Let me see, I have Zoom on here.
What's your son gonna be for Halloween?
A Dementor.
Oh, that's scary.
Pretty simple costume though.
That's a good one.
Yeah, well, we've had like costumes that weren't scary, and I kind of suggested.
It makes sense that he's a Dementor.
I said,
I feel like, I don't know, I feel like that makes sense that he would want to be.
Oh, okay.
Not like wrong wording.
Here you go. I'm gonna get
I thought maybe you knew how much you liked it.
That's
probably
what she was saying.
Yeah,
Just said it,
I
but
just-
to put them together.
Being your son, it makes sense that
Oh.
you would.
Oh.
Wants to send me
So it's more of an impression on you. And so
Has he ever wanted to do something like super weird?
The weirdest one was he was like 4 or 5, and that was when we came here for trick or treating. He said when we asked him what he wanted to be, he said, I want to be a box of roads. And I was like, what are you talking about? It's like, I want you to make a box, put it on me, and then make roads on it. And so we did. We made a suit out of a box, and we put little roads on it, and then we like Velcro cars, matchbox cars. And we really wanted to like drive matchbox cars around on roads on his body. So, box of roads.
See, a lot of people say that they like hate little kids until you can actually talk to them. I'm like, little kids do funny shit.
They're
Like
wild.
they're weird, they're ridiculous, and it's awesome.
I dressed up as the Witch King of Dagmar from the Lord of the Rings in 5th grade. My parents were not.
Why?
They were like, that's scary. Don't you want to be Eowyn? And I was like, no.
I don't know why we scary weird things on Halloween. That's the opportunity
like the whole
to dress. That's the point, right? Like, I don't know.
Especially if it's religious, it's like, because I come from a very religious family, it's if you're scary, you're kind of like moving towards the devil.
Satan gets
like,
you.
Oh,
Satan's gonna
True.
get you. I was
That's not true.
an angel for many, many years. because my grandmother made me an angel costume, which was horrendous because I had these giant wings, and every time I turned, I just someone in the face. Like,
Can I borrow those for my eternal Sailor Moon cosplay?
I don't have them with me for sure. Yes. If you remind me, I'm sure I can find them at some point.
I've done this a couple times before.
So what is Ellis? I am a freshman, in case you couldn't tell. What is this place?
It used to be the president's house, and now it's the philosophy and religion building, because it's a little weird to have the actual president living on campus.
That is a little.
Yeah,
But like
little
this
strange.
is a house, if you can tell.
yeah, gives
um,
house vibes.
Yeah, a few years ago, it was the financial office.
It's been the welcome center also.
Yeah, so it's, but I think now it's probably. gonna
It's
be an
nice.
It's gonna be this for a
Yeah.
while.
Are students just allowed to like hang out here? This is
Yes.
lovely.
Oh, yeah.
They'll
I
have
study there all the
sunroom, yeah, it's a great place to be.
I knew when I walked in, I could smell Nietzsche in the air.
Your computer's right there,
Yes.
right
Okay.
for you, everything's set up.
Wow, okay.
You have
academic buildings.
nothing to worry about.
Usually you need to leave by 5 or you can't get in at 5. But once you have your like major.
So they'll be able to see
professors,
where-
you might get access really late in the night.
I'm fully intended to major in religious studies. I'm already looking at seminaries and stuff. So.
Yeah, very cool. Have you seen the UMYF store?
UMYF, is it for Methodists?
Yes.
I am a Presbyterian.
Well,
Presbyterian Episcopalian sort of thing.
well, unless you just don't want to, it wouldn't matter. You're not going to be excluded.
Yeah. Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. So I'm in the UMYF program.
Well,
I'm not religious studies.
You do have to be a member for a year to apply.
You have to be a member of the Methodist Church for a year.
That's At least you need to give them one.
I thought you just needed to like participate.
Is there really
like
like-
write a good?
No hate to the Methodists.
I know it was on the application, maybe they wanted to reject it.
Or they
Or they don't, or they. So. We're working on it.
I know, y'all are having
there.
y'all are having a moment right now.
Well,
That's
you said-
okay.
You said
I know a lot
they,
of
they
classes
said
have done those people that were.
I was very confused.
I mean, actually, no, we have nothing valuable to say. Please don't ordain us, actually.
Well, in our defense,
I don't want this to be.
a few years ago, it was kind of just a don't talk about it thing, and there's like plenty of ordained gay people in the Methodist church.
Nice.
Like a lot.
It's, if you go to a Methodist church, there's a pretty harsh line between like more conservative and then the very liberal.
Global Methodists and then you.
Give us like 3 years and I'm sure we'll.
Well, isn't that what, are they deciding that this year? Or they not?
I mean, they've supposedly decided it like 4 times already.
Didn't they decide like not like everyone kind of split and go their own?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I was about to say. I'm
It's
pretty
just
sure it's
slowly.
congregation by congregation.
Schism.
Yeah.
I joke, but we did our own thing back in the 70s. Hello, PCA.
That's true, but that was over women.
Yeah, at least you. We
You
split
know,
over
that's actually
slavery,
true.
but.
You guys were kind of pioneers when it came to women getting more. Municipals, we didn't ordain until 1979.
Yeah, now you guys are ahead of us.
I'm actually going to St. Peter's right now because St. Peter's is a walkable.
I go
So
to St. Peter's every night. I've been like once or twice. What do you think of that?
I really love it. Although I went to an ear appointment and the guy was this crotchety old Episcopalian man. And he was like, I went to St. Peter's for a year, but it was just far too low church for me. You need to come to Christ Church. He was like, you need to come to Christ Church in Little Rock.
That's where I think I've gone to both of those churches like an equal amount, but I do like Christ Church a lot, not because it's not really high church. I don't know what.
He was like, he just kept going on and on about how it's low church. And I was like, I really like the community. He was great though. He was talking
That just
about
means
how,
they don't have incense anymore.
yeah. Oh no.
What's the difference between the high church and the church?
High church is like incense, smells and bells.
Which
a lot
St.
more
Peter's
conferences,
has though.
yeah.
St. Peter's, it felt kind of like he was what he meant was that St. Peter's was just smaller, but what he said was that it was low church because
Is
St.
this
Peter's.
something that Episcopalians say of Catholics in a derogatory way?
No,
Yes.
it
Yeah.
is, the more high church, the better, in the Episcopal church, like the more like the Catholics, the better.
Really?
I mean, depending on who you
Interesting.
talk to,
is
but
it
like
a
in
status
this
thing?
context,
In
then I
this
would say low
context?
church, like, I don't like that we don't do the Anglo-Catholic stuff.
I was like, okay, but what's wrong with my ear?
incense and bells, that's the descriptor.
So, well, yeah, I mean, there's more to like chanting.
He had some issues with the liturgy.
Yeah, it's always candles, either way.
Yeah.
Wait, what did you say?
He was like, he had some issues with the liturgy. I was like, I don't know, dude, what's wrong with my ear? I did not receive a conclusive answer.
Hey, baby, how's it going?
I can't be here very long, but I want to be here for some time.
Okay. I will not be upset when you walk out.
Okay.
I'll stare at you, don't worry.
Yeah,
While you're
I'll
walking,
wait
just
till you are
the shame stare.
I have to get yesterday. It's okay, I have to send Wednesday. So are you
Professor Corey?
He texted me yesterday.
I'm Bethany Sanders, a freshman.
Okay. And what's your name?
Gray.
Gray?
Yes.
What year are you?
Sophomore.
Not the
Okay.
extra $2, the extra
What is it?
Oh,
Nice.
It's like,
No, we're all
but
building
one of them was just.
Definitely haven't achieved enlightenment, not like even remotely. I don't know where our abilities are, but I do know roughly that is not.
I wandered around possibly.
You know what?
Just
I
learning
find
yourself
one
every
is the best
day.
way to find anything you're looking for.
Absolutely.
So
I covered that last week.
yeah, but if they were open on Saturday for a really long time, like all my classes were just so back to back. Like I worked from 11 to 5 p.m. But if I had time, I would love to just wander for like 5 hours and go into every hole and every crevice and just like map out the whole place.
I want to go in that. Is that the lead mountain?
Oh, Bueller?
Yeah.
Yes.
It has its best
Especially
times.
Everywhere.
Well, that's why I will not be in this building after 5 p.m.
I heard, I used to go to a lot of church camps here. I heard
Oh,
a lot
yeah.
of rumors that this used to be like slave quarters.
It was. The stairs are an indication of that.
Wait, are you serious?
Wait, really?
I thought that was all fake.
No, there's a president who lives here. and
That's
there's
highly
servants.
relevant to the conversation we were
That's
having in
it.
this building.
There's servants, and there's servant stairs.
Interesting.
But if you do want to get go back over and see what
Really?
Could I go?
I
I tried to break in, but none of the windows would open. So.
I can ask them for you. I know who knows how to get it.
Really? I don't know if I want to.
Does it have asbestos?
Yeah.
I feel like those are the last
There's
thing.
gotta be some of that.
I heard that's
I
something they
just
should
figured
have
all
done.
the two crazy things
Fulfilled.
over there for Halloween, you know? No.
They should.
That's a real sign that it's not.
I think the building's like falling down there, isn't it? Or is it just asbestos?
It's just a little contaminated. Just a little icky.
I love creepy stuff like that.
I think of it during the. but, no. I know there is some.
I guess, I'm assuming, are you religious studies?
Uh-huh.
Okay, well, I mean, if you believe in the protection of God, all good.
Consider.
But I also believe in ghosts.
Really? I also
I
believe in
believe in
ghosts,
all
which
kinds of stuff.
I know that isn't in line with Christian doctrine, but I just can't not.
But
No,
also,
it's not.
why would you ever say that they don't, it's really, you can't rule anything out.
Ghosts are totally Christian.
Consider
Holy Ghost.
religious life lock-in here sometime during Halloween.
No, 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 no.
Is my evangelical showing? Maybe a little bit.
I don't remember. That's a no.
Really? It's very welcoming.
There's also a very big difference between spirits and humans. Spirits are, I don't think they're able to possess in traditional theories. So like,
I love that within 10 minutes we're already
Again,
talking about demonic
yeah,
possession.
I'm never gonna rule anything out.
yeah, but I don't know, just a little incense and white light.
About sage.
I do have fish face. Actually, not really.
I think the only big danger is trying to quote scripture to something you think might be evil. The thing like that you should.
Yeah, but it does work on some movies.
On what?
In movies, when
Is there demonic? Is there like a demons class here, please?
Maybe a mythology class or something.
Yeah.
You ever?
Witchcraft.
Exorcism.
Why is there an exorcism?
I'm not
class?
taught a demons class. I think my predecessor,
Sam?
Frances Flannery taught some. She taught monsters.
Wenja teaches Asian demons and demon gods and supernatural,
Okay,
right?
ancient demons, I don't do. Those are the
That's where
scary.
the teaching.
I don't know what's up.
That's where you draw the line.
That's where I actually draw the line. I don't know what's going on over there. They have some scary stuff. Especially if I can't speak the language. I don't know how they're cursing me. I don't know what's happening.
You all are welcome to the snacks. There's so many.
Yeah.
On that table back there. Behind you all. Oh.
What's Nairobi?
City, the capital city.
Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, it sounded very familiar, but I was like,
I thought New England was a state until last year. So
it did kind of used to be an American state.
it did.
But we haven't been there
It
for a while.
I mean, they have their own football team, so.
That's true.
That's definitely the defining factor of
I
what a
was
state.
thinking, why would you think that?
I missed Mom's princess. I got bushes right before I came here. It's like the worst mistake of my life.
I'm scared.
The Welsh is not
No, they just like lack the flavor.
No, they have like a fruit, another fruits that are literally the worst. But they're like,
You know, I prefer for my food not to gush.
I don't want to.
It's 4 years. I don't know. People call it school.
All right, well, thanks everybody for coming. Welcome to the Wednesday afternoon discussion of the Steel Center. Today, we're grateful to have Emmy, our very own Emmy Corey, who's a PhD candidate at Emory in religious studies, studying ethics, society. Expressed that one of your loves is medical anthropology, right? Works at a lot of intersection of different disciplines, and we're grateful you're going to share your research with us today. So let's give it a warm up.
A few of you, not that few, okay, taking my mask off. You never know where you guys are gonna fall right. So I'm gonna be talking a little bit more than I would probably like to be talking today, but I have made myself feel better about that by telling you and telling myself I'm gonna be telling you guys a lot of stories today. So my research is based in Nairobi, Kenya. So Nairobi is the capital of Kenya. It's a huge city. I can't remember how many people off the top of my head. But it is a very large city in the middle of Kenya. And I am going to talk to you, I give you some background before I dig into these stories, because I think you need to know this background before I do. So I did ethnographic research. So that's essentially in my field, that is participation and observation. So living or working with a community, in my case, working with a community and working alongside them. And so this is an organization called Wana Mwema, which means the good child in Swahili. It's kind of hard to ping pong back. Okay. So anyway, it's a network of clinics in Nairobi. There are 8 of them. They are funded by the US government currently through the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, as well as PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. There are 8 clinics across the city. They are for children and adolescents who are living with HIV. So HIV, I'll just go ahead and tell you what HIV is, just in case. No, you won't. So HIV is a virus that suppresses the white blood cells in the body and suppresses the immune system. So it makes your body more susceptible to what's called opportunistic infections. So it could be things like pneumonia, it could be tuberculosis. even severe bouts of malaria, but essentially keeps your body from fighting off those infections in the way that they would if you were not living with HIV. These children were born with the virus because one of their parents or both of their parents had the virus and it was transmitted to them. So they've been on medication called anti-retroviral medication their entire lives, or really since they were 2. Some of them when they were older started, but this medication you take at the same time every single day, usually with food, often with food. That's been kind of a controversial back and forth. But it requires a lot of stability. And what's hard about stability in these particular clinics is that they're all set in informal settlements that look kind of like this. So this is Kibera, where I was working. So you can see it's a lot of people living together in corrugated tin houses. So these are temporary housing, and that temporary housing can be threatened by things like flood. Sometimes the government will demolish a neighborhood for development projects. There's all kinds of things that kind of threaten these neighborhoods. So taking your medicine every single day is a really hard thing to do. Just to back up really quickly, the organization is Catholic, and they've been around since the early 90s. So they've been a really early adopter of pediatric HIV care in the country. And I've known them for about 12 years, but my fieldwork with them was for 7 months. Okay, so 2 of the concepts that I'm working with in this are healing as collective well-being and medication as a moral practice. I'm about to tell you what those things are, so don't worry. So healing as collective well-being is a notion that came up in almost every conversation that I had in Kenya and every interaction that I had at Wanawema. The idea is that healing is collective and that physical healing can't be extracted or removed from spiritual, social, political, economic, psychological well-being. All of those issues are framed as health. And this is consistent in African religions, for those of you in that class are, with Ubuntu, or the notion of collective personhood, which means I am because we are. So this idea of collective well-being is present at Wanawema, but it is not unique just to Wanawema. The other thing, when people, I did maybe 70 interviews while I was there, and 70 of those interviews, this was the notion of healing that came up. And I'm paraphrasing it, but this is more or less what people said when I asked them what illness and healing were. They said illness is when you're isolated, you can't do your work or participate. Health is when you're no longer isolated and you can do your work and participate in life. So what you're seeing here is that to be ill is to be isolated from the community, and to be well is to be restored to collective life. There's another, there's an African theologian, Laurenti Magesa, who's from Tanzania, and he actually talks about medicine, which we're about to talk about. But he talks about medicine as this restoration between the individual and the community, that when you're taking medication, it's a reminder that you are part of a collective life. And so that is a lot of what's going on here with some of these folks. Any questions about that before I keep going? So I talk about in this paper moral practice. Medicine is a moral practice. And when I'm talking about the moral, I'm not talking about like good or bad. Moral comes from, it's a term used by a sociologist called Emil Durkheim, and he talks about moral as the social, right? So that our moral life is our life together. It's how we're kind of inculcated in community. So when I talk about moral, I'm not saying it's necessarily good or necessarily bad, but that it's something that is socially conditioned. Durkheim calls it a social fact. I'm talking about this moral practice. This is an anthropologist called Nina Das, who talks about a moral practice as a self-fashioning in which a person brings themselves into alignment with a moral tradition that lies outside of oneself. So doing the internal work, and usually this work is regular habitual practices that can bring you into alignment with a moral tradition that lies outside. That might sound really nebulous. I hope it will sound more concrete once you actually hear these stories. But are there any questions about this? Okay. So generally what I'm talking about is medication, taking your drugs well, which is this concept that was repeated a lot at Wanawema as a moral practice that brings young adults in particular out of isolation into collective well-being or healing. Sometimes. And sometimes it does not. I'm going to keep this up here. This is just a glossary. So when I say these words and you're like, what does that word mean again? You can look right there. It's nothing. But then if you need clarification, when we get through these stories. Okay, so let's move into these people's stories. So by the way, these are peer mentors. So a lot of them are around y'all's age. Some they're older than you are because I did this in 2019. But they were at the time around your age. So here we go, taking your drugs well. My Nairobi living room has never been this full or this fragrant. The somehow universal scent of cologne that follows 20-year-old men in both the United States and Kenya mixes with the smell of pizza as a few participants linger around the table, picking at what's left at stacked Domino's boxes. The call to prayer comes from the mosque in the center of nearby Kibera settlement and drifts through the open windows. I take that as my signal to begin the focus group discussion on healing that I had so carefully prepared a few weeks prior. The concept was not unfamiliar to this group of young adults. They're peer mentors from Wanawema Clinic, a network of clinics across Nairobi, Kenya, that provide care and treatment for children and adolescents living with HIV. They work among the 8 clinics to provide counseling and mentorship for adolescents that come in each month to pick up their medications. The peer mentors are all too familiar with HIV treatment since they are also living with the virus. Most of them have been Wanawema patients since early childhood. I begin the session with a story about healing, one that was familiar to this Christian audience. We read the story of Naaman, an army commander with leprosy who sought a cure from the prophet Elisha. Elisha instructs Naaman to go wash in the Jordan River to be healed. Naaman initially protests these directions, but eventually agrees to wash himself and is cured. I was certain the story would resonate with the peer mentors, that they would all identify with a desperate warrior searching for a cure for a disease that had none. But they didn't identify with Naaman or the miracle. Very quickly after we finished reading, the conversation focused on Naaman's inability to follow directions. One peer mentor, Paul, suggested, "What I've learned from this story is that no matter how superior you are, you should just follow instructions." Another mentor, John, echoed this statement. "Yeah, man, it's very important to follow instructions. I knew a rich man who once told me that point A is where you are and point B is where you want to be. The only way from one point to another is by following directions. So instructions matter a lot in money, in healing, in everything." The other participants murmured their echoes of agreement. I started to realize that maybe I was reading Naaman all wrong. For the peer mentors, he wasn't the recipient of a divine miracle. Instead, he was a non-compliant patient whose healing could only come when he listened to the instructions given to him. The healing of Naaman was about doing what you're told to get from point A to point B. At first, I was disappointed in this response. What's so interesting about doing what you're told? But as I got to know the peer mentors, I realized that this journey from point A to point B is hardly a straightforward process. There's much more to rule following than one might think. As John, who is deeply immersed in yoga and self-help books, might put it, the journey toward following instructions is the destination itself. It's a moral practice that brings peer mentors back into collective well-being. Taking your drugs well is a phrase often repeated at Wanawema by practitioners and patients alike. This phrase, used to describe a person's ability to take his or her anti-retroviral medications correctly, is a complex and fragile practice that makes moral demands on peer mentors as they navigate the vulnerabilities of living with HIV in Nairobi. It's a practice fraught with existential and sometimes spiritual meaning. Today, I'll talk about this phrase a little bit before turning to 2 peer mentors, Toya and Charlene. Both women were, for a time, modern-day Naamans. They each describe lengthy periods of not taking their drugs well. These past moments play an important role in the way both women think about themselves and subsequently their relationship with their medication and their community. As Toya and Charlene demonstrate, taking your drugs well is an intimate individual exercise that holds different meaning for every person living with HIV. For many peer mentors, it doesn't just describe a practice. but is instead a state of physical, spiritual, and mental well-being that was achieved by overcoming internal and external obstacles. Many peer mentors depicted good adherence as a turning point that they used to mark their lives before and after adherence to antiretroviral medication. For many peer mentors, the practice of following medical instructions was not just the way from point A to point B, it is a point B, a destination in its own right. Taking your drugs well then, listening to instructions, that was the miracle. Throughout my time in Nairobi, members of WAD stressed the importance of antiretroviral treatment for both patients and the organization as a whole. As countless people explained to me, if a person living with HIV doesn't take their medication, their viral load or the amount of HIV in their virus increases, making them more susceptible to opportunistic infections. If a person takes their medication regularly, as instructed, he or she is thought to have good adherence. They can even reach a state of viral suppression where the virus is undetectable in his or her bloodstream. Adherence or non-adherence to antiretroviral treatment also lays bare a host of economic, political, and social vulnerabilities to the organization. As members of the WAD community will tell you, taking your drugs well is easier said than done. In the informal settlements where the clinics are located, there are numerous obstacles to prevent patients from adhering well to antiretroviral treatment. Many live in temporary houses. You can look at this picture again. Many live in temporary houses. They're threatened by heavy rain and flooding. Some of the settlements are not registered with the government, which renders them even more vulnerable. And at times, some neighborhoods have been cleared at a moment's notice in the name of a development project. Moreover, most of WAD's community's clients live in extreme poverty. Many are unemployed or underemployed, depending on infrequent casual labor to keep their families fed. They remain on the move, looking for work where they can find it. The transitory lives of many members of WAD renders taking your drugs well an unstable and fragile practice. As many peer mentors told me, external factors are only a few obstacles that impede adherence. Many of them have found their biggest challenge to be their own internal relationship with the medication. One peer mentor, Toya, has had a few times in her life when she stopped taking medication altogether. Like many of her fellow peer mentors, the most significant moment came when she was a teenager, almost always in 10th grade, by the way. I don't know why. This is when these moments happen. And it did for Toya in 10th grade. Like many of her fellow peer mentors, the most significant moment came when she was a teenager. She'd been on antiretroviral medication since she was a small child, but she never really felt ill. She started to believe that she didn't need the medication, so she began to master the skill of not taking her medication. Like many adolescents, she was good at sneaking around and concealing parts of her life from the adults around her. And she says, "I was somehow stupid intelligent. Whenever I was given the drugs, I wouldn't take them. And I knew the date I was supposed to go back to the clinic. So I'd take the right number of drugs and hide them. And that's when when I would go back to the clinic, I knew that they would count the number of tablets. That's why I would say I was stupid intelligent. So when the doctor would ask, do you take your drugs? Yes. Have you missed them? No. Because I was tired. I was taking these drugs and I was saying to myself, I'm okay, I'm not sick. Why am I taking these drugs? So I stopped taking my Septrin. That's when I started to get sick." Toya's practice of hiding her medication every month wasn't a decision she made on a whim. She was diligent about it. She kept track of her pills regularly. She checked on them, counted them, and made sure to remove the ones she should have taken. She didn't discard those pills either. She checked on them regularly to make sure no one discovered her secret. Eventually, Toya did start getting sick, and rashes appeared on her body. But she still didn't take the Septrin. Each month, the doctor would ask Toya if she was taking her medication, and each month she would say yes. And every time he would remind her that Septrin, which is a prophylactic antibiotic that helps clear up rashes and keeps her from getting sick. So the doctor would remind her of this every month. And at the end of every visit, he would give Toya's aunt long lectures about the importance of Septrin. One month, he even told Toya's aunt that they would be burying her niece soon if she didn't start back on her medication. Everyone's exasperation weighed on Toya. She started to worry that her doctor was right, that maybe one day they would be burying her. Toya got tired of feeling ill all the time, so little by little, she started to take Perceptrin again. She describes this as a turning point. The day I started to really feel healthy was when I started taking drugs without skipping any. I felt different. I looked different. Even my aunt was telling me, you look good, you look really nice. I knew it was because of the drugs. Toya takes her drugs well now. After all, it's a practice tied to a host of other things. She feels good, she looks good. She tells me she even eats well because of the medication. Toya is now 21, and taking medication means something different for her than it did as a child. Her body remembers what it's like to not take the drugs, and this memory shapes her understanding of the importance of taking her drugs well. Walker, the peer mentor coordinator, says that peer mentors expect most adolescents will go through a period of not taking their medication. He says, after a certain point, we'll just let them stop their medication. The text of it, words here. After a certain point, we just let them stop their medication. Something will happen and they'll come back. They'll go through some period of pain that they wouldn't experience if they'd just taken their medicine from start to finish. Pain had been a turning point for many of the peer mentors, Walker included. He describes his moment as, quote, an attack of the chest. Another peer mentor tells me his moment was herpes zoster or shingles. And if you know anyone who's had that, it is very, very painful. For another, it was pneumonia. Like Toya, most peer mentors describe these periods as a moment of healing. Pain put them on a path towards taking their drugs well, towards making a perhaps temporary and delicate peace with both their medication and their status. But the prescription of pain does not always work to bring every person back into the medicated fold. One peer mentor, Charlene, has a uniquely complicated relationship with taking her medications. Taking her drugs well carries spiritual ambiguity and at times spiritual anxiety. 9 years ago, Charlene's mother, Nancy, stopped taking her medication after she received healing prayers from a prominent pastor and prophet in the area. To this day, Nancy is not on antiretroviral medication. Despite a brief bout with illness, Charlene's mother seems to be doing well. She hasn't been tested for HIV since the pastor prayed for her, but Charlene thinks she's healthy. Like Toya, Nancy looks healthy. Charlene once showed me a photo of her mother exclaiming, "See, look how plump she is. She's doing good." Charlene thinks her mother is a special case. She and other family members agree that Nancy is somehow predisposed to miraculous healing. She seems to have a knack for getting her prayers answered. Charlene tells me, "My auntie says it takes a lot of faith to be healed, but your mom is really faithful. She's a prayerful woman." Charlene agrees with her aunt and thinks that God has certainly rewarded her mother's faith. After all, Nancy has spent the better part of a decade not taking her medication. She even has a good job driving a Nairobi shuttle bus and owns her own home. Charlene is not as certain that God listens to her prayers. She tells me, quote, "I'm not as strong as my mother. I just don't think I have the kind of faith she has," end quote. It's not that Charlene doesn't believe in God. She just doesn't believe she has the same kind of connection with God as her mother. She confesses, "I sometimes feel like God has forsaken me, like I'm not really friends with God." Because of this, Charlene says she's going to keep taking her medication until there's a cure. She's too nervous to stop her medication like her mother did. "I would feel too guilty," Charlene says. "What if I go to a pastor and he prays for me and then I stop taking my medication? Then what if something happens to me? I feel bad for stopping my medicine. I feel so stressed even when I take it late." Despite her anxiety about missing medication, Charlene had her own period of not taking her drugs well. A few months prior to our meeting, she was depressed and didn't want to live anymore. She felt like God had given up on her. Unlike Toya and Walker, Charlene didn't go through an experience of immense pain that brought her back to her medication. It was actually Charlene's mother that brought her back to medication. One day, Nancy, Charlene's mom, received a call from the doctor at Wanawema who informed her that Charlene was not taking her medication. Nancy immediately called Charlene to express concern for her daughter. After a few moments of chiding Charlene, Nancy's voice softened and she said, "Charlene, your dreams are important, but you can't reach your dreams without your medicine. You have to do better. You have to try and do better." That day, Shirlene promised her mother that she would indeed try. Shirlene assumes her mother is open to her daughter's medication practices because she knows that Shirlene's faith is different than her own. Shirlene muses, I think my mom knows that my faith isn't as strong as the one that she has. Shirlene's experience with not taking her medicine is more recent than Toya's. She's not assigned the same kind of meaning to her time of not taking her medication, nor does she have any memory of bodily pain, but she does remember her mother and the commitment she made to her to try and do better. Her relationship with her mother has also made taking her medication a statement of faith that evokes a certain amount of anxiety. It's an acknowledgement of her mother's strong faith and her own shaky one. For both Toya and Shirlene, taking your drugs well has become embedded in the way they think about themselves and their relationship to the people around them. This work is easy on some days and extremely difficult on others, and yet they're asked to take their medicine every day at the same time in the same way. The practice is a moral one, evoking commitments that women have made to themselves, to their communities, and to God. It works to bring them out of isolation and back into the presence of others, back into collective well-being. For peer mentors, the mundane practice of taking medication, of following instructions, is a little miraculous, a divine intervention on its own. It helped them return to collective well-being when they needed it most. At the same time, taking your drugs well doesn't preclude the possibility of other forms of miraculous healing, like that of Naaman, or even Nancy for peer mentors. Instead, taking your drugs well serves as a steady placeholder as they journey toward an uncertain future. Shirlene and Toya hope for a cure, but they and other members of the Guantanamo community worry that one day the drugs will run out and that the world that has been built upon distributing them will crumble. So for now, many peer mentors focus on the delicate path from point A to point B for taking their drugs well. So I thought that I have no questions for you guys to get us started, which makes me feel a little vulnerable, but I kind of want to know what you're thinking. And that does a lot of me reading to you. Yeah.
I'm curious if ever like taking their medication was like a thing of like shortage, like they wanted to like kind of ration it out as like a fear to like it would go out, like because of the situation, the living situation that they were in, like if everything was lost and they weren't able to like get their medication like within like the time that their house is flooded. Or
yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yes and no. So Septrin, actually, the antibiotic, is a really interesting one in that it's actually not an anti-retroviral medication. It's like what you might take for some kind of infection here. But there's stockouts all the time where Septrin is suddenly unavailable. So they actually do have some issues sometimes with running out of Septrin. I don't think that was what was going on in Toya's mind at the time. But they can't really, because of the nature of antiretrovirals and because you have to take them every day, they can't really do like, I'm not going to take this one today and take it tomorrow so that I have more later. Yeah. Which is definitely something that I do with my medicine that I don't have to take every day, right? You can save it for later. Yeah, Lauren.
What is the process for them to get the medicine?
That's a good question. So they will. So around the age of 2, if you are still testing as positive for HIV, you are referred to a clinic. And so most of them are referred to a clinic either by providers at hospitals or just by other people in the community who say, hey, you should go check out this organization. And so when they go, usually what happens is they're started on antiretroviral drugs there. What's really unique about the process in general with PEPFAR is that there's a lot of, again, there's continuity is like the most important thing. So the model is that you always have to go to the same clinic to get your medication. So from the age of 2 on, usually a little older than 2, people are going once a month and they're meeting with their doctor, a counselor, a social worker, and a nutritionist. And those are the people who kind of make sure that you are in fact taking your drugs well. But because it is this model of going to the same clinic, you have kids that have lived their entire lives going to the same clinics. They have these very deep relationships with their practitioners.
I guess I'm wondering, what's your personal argument for this topic? Because you've told a lot of stories, and in some ways, it seems like this applies most like strongly in very specific environments. I don't know how much it applies here sometimes in everyday life. So like, what's the moral of the story?
Well, I think it does apply here. And I think one of the ways in particular that I'm trying to think about in my dissertation is I'm trying to get us, I think we often think of objects like medicine as just that, right? It's like, so what? You're taking medicine every day, there's no meaning there. But there is meaning in it. And I think part of that meaning is pulling us to think about ourselves and our bodies a little bit differently. So thinking about things like the mind, the body, and the spirit as these all interconnected things. And that even something that seems like it might not be important, like medicine, actually can play a part in that. So I think what I want us to do is think a little bit differently about the way we treat healing in particular. And think about like what happens when you think about all of these issues that, if I can go back to the slide, but this idea of collective well-being, if you're thinking about all of these things as inextricable, so thinking about political, social, economic, spiritual well-being as health, how does that change the way you actually think about those things? Because I think our tendency here is to think about these through different disciplines, right? It's like what we do in the liberal arts is we say, oh, we'll go to political science to think about this thing. We'll go to English, philosophy, religion to think about the meaning of life. But actually, we can think about all of these things as interconnected with this idea of collective well-being. And my kind of like, so what too to that is how would COVID-19 have gone differently? So writing all of this and thinking about these stories in the middle of COVID-19 was really an important thing for me because it was really watching this lack of collective well-being.
That's kind of what I was thinking about while you were saying that. It is, especially like COVID is a great example, but if I'm thinking about somebody who takes medication for mental health issues, especially depression. In a society where oftentimes we don't have collective well-being, how do we convey that message? How do we get them to care and see that importance? Because a lot of times when somebody has a mental health issue, not only are you trying to get them to care about themselves, but you're like, think about your family.
And I mean, if any of you have been on antidepressants or anything like that, when you finally find the medicine that works, that's huge, right? And but so much of that, even that system here, is very fragile. And there are lots of things that can undermine your ability to even take that kind of medicine. So this works, I think, in a similar way, actually.
As someone who takes medication every day for anxiety and ADHD, I really connected with Toya's sort of inner dialogue of self-sabotage. Like, I'm fine, even though the doctors and my parents are telling me that I need to take this medication. I refuse to because I want to believe that I'm okay. There's nothing wrong here. In the sense of like, if I ignore it, it doesn't exist. It's something that I found very true. My friends who also take medication, it's like by taking your medication, you're forced to confront the problems in your life. I don't know. That doesn't really connect to communal healing. Sorry.
Well, it kind of does. I mean, because think about the way you participate in your community when you're taking your medicine versus when, I mean, I also can't take my medicine for ADD right now, but I usually do when I'm not pregnant, and I'm a much better listener.
When I go 3 days without Lexapro, oh boy.
Yeah, I mean, there are, and you know, there's a darker side to that too, but I think that I do think it does kind of keep you in relationship with the people around you in a way that is often helpful. I think what's interesting about Toya and interesting about HIV in general is that because these kids have been on these drugs for so long, they actually don't remember a time that they were sick. And so they never had experienced like acute physical illness usually until they stop taking it. And that's why it becomes this really important thing, because it's like the first time people actually realize, oh, I actually do need to take this medicine.
Have they noticed this pattern with like other people who have like some sort of illness whenever they're a child? Like, is this like a consistent thing with this sort of like, not necessarily HIV, but other illnesses? Like, is this a noted pattern? Or is it just for HIV?
I really think it's mostly for HIV. I think that HIV is a unique virus in the Nairobi landscape, and that the people have just really gotten a hold of and figured out antiretroviral treatment. And I don't think that works across the board for every single medication, but I think in particular for this one that they're taking every day, it does. Yeah.
Like, how common is HIV in Nairobi?
Well, that's what's kind of interesting. It depends on when you're looking. I don't know the rates off the top of my head, what they are right now. I know that in sub-Saharan Africa in general, the prevalence rates, the overall percentage of people living with HIV is about 4%. But that encompasses both these kids and like a whole lot of other people. That it's pretty rare now for children to be born with the virus, because they have, there's something called post-mother to child transmission, which is when you start treating the mother, so an expectant mother, you start giving her medication, antiretroviral medication, and that helps kids be born negative. So these kids are actually like the first group of children to grow up living with the virus. But they're still they're a pretty small percentage of the population. But I would say it's more common in sub-Saharan Africa than it is here, although new infections here are going up, and in parts of the South, in Georgia in particular, new infections are similar to West African. So.
Cross-cultural question.
Yeah.
So like in this context, the way that this kind of moral argument for collective well-being is played out, it doesn't seem like there's, you said they meet with doctors, but is there an argument that like your health will be better and here's a medical reason, or here's like a scientific argument?
Yeah.
Right? And but yet like here during COVID, people at work, even in the context of medicine, it's like you want this individual health. Here are the medical reasons, but then the sort of like obligations to others, or
Yeah.
obligations to your family, I'll leave that up to your faith, or I'll leave that up to your moral life,
Yeah.
right? It's more like focused on kind of individual.
Yeah.
So is there a sort of medical, straightforwardly scientific medical argument that
For keeping people on the
Yeah,
drugs? Yes,
yeah.
yes.
And how does that work? Does that convince them, or
Yeah,
that
usually not as much.
Yeah.
It honestly usually is these moments of not taking their medicine that keeps people on medicine.
Yeah.
So it's these moments of realizing, oh, here's what happens to me. I feel completely and totally isolated from my family. But when I take these drugs, I feel like more connected and I feel better. The medical reason is still part of so one of the reasons that taking your drugs is so important for like the reason PEPFAR wants all these kids on drugs, on antiretroviral drugs, is because that if the virus is fully suppressed, you can't transmit it. And so there is a collective sort of public health message to it too. It doesn't always come up. It's really interesting. These kids know so much medical jargon, like they really, and because they're talking to other kids about it every day too. But they don't, that rarely seems to be the thing that feels compelling to people. Although I'm sure there is like a just general, like, I don't want to die. I want to take this medicine because I don't want to die.
But I think there's also, I mean, talk about depression, like there are a number of cases, not like a huge percentage at one and where people really did just get super depressed and just stop their medicine altogether and did die. And so there is this like a lot of peer mentor work kind of calling for and advocating for better access to mental health care, but there isn't really enough. And PEPFAR is certainly not having. So. That one.
When you said they meet with social workers, what does a social worker do?
Well, I have intimate knowledge of what the social workers do, because that's where I spend most of my time. It depends on the day and it depends on the need. So usually when you come to pick up your drugs, you go and you just check in with the social worker. So you could go and if you're younger, you would go with a parent. And so say I go with my child and I say, hey, we're here to check in. Susie has been doing well. She's been taking her drugs well, but we can't really afford to send her to school every day. So we need help paying school fees. So social workers can do things like make referrals for school fees. They make referrals for food, even though nutritionists can write prescriptions, but there's only so much they can do. So they do those things and help with housing. I mean, they do a lot of the things you would think social workers do here, and then they also like go above and beyond. So like I know social workers who have like many social workers who have like given their own money to a client that walks in and says, I'm having trouble paying the school fees, or one doctor had like took a kid home and circumcised him, and it was, you know, like they do a lot more than just the social work part, but they also do a whole lot of data entry. So USAID and PEPFAR both require a lot of bookkeeping. And so that is a lot of what they do when they're not meeting with clients.
And are they paid like a pretty good?
They're not paid well. They're paid pretty terribly. Yeah, they're paid, I think it ends up being like 20,000 shillings a month, which is about $200. And this is not just social workers, like the doctors are paid about that too. So they're not paid very well. They really like to tell me about that.
Are they for living conditions themselves?
Yes and no. Like if you or I went to some of their houses, some of them are really nice houses, but that's because their families have money. And then some of them live in like more, they don't quite live in like Canberra, like that settlement that I showed a picture of, but they might live on the outskirts of town. It's smaller, just what they would call more modest houses. So yeah, it's not as, they definitely stay awake thinking about their clients' economic conditions, but there are several who work there who talk about hustling, and they have tons of side jobs that kind of help get them through.
One of the things I noticed in your talk is that religion can be invoked on sort of both sides of this question of like getting people to care for themselves in this way, that emphasis on community and well-being and interconnectedness on the one hand, and if you trusted God enough, you wouldn't need your medicine.
Yeah.
You notice the same thing here, I think, with around issues of mental health. I mean, you notice the same thing around issues of COVID, that religion can function on both sides. And I'm just curious if you've seen examples of how, like, what kinds of interventions do people make to access the positive side of religion in that way?
Yeah, so the big one is faith healing. So like Nancy, Shirley's mom, went for faith healing and stopped taking her medicine. This is an issue that happens with a number of clients. It happened more when I was there in 2011 than it does now, but part of what they do is, and this is kind of an interesting like institutional quandary, I think, for me, but part of what they'll do is like go to the pastor who's offering healing and talk to them and try to like help them think about other ways to like offer healing without telling patients to stop taking their medications.
But it takes a lot of time and energy and effort, and you have to meet with a pastor many, many, many times before they might change their tune on that, if ever. So that's one tactic that people use, and also just like meeting with the person regularly. So in 2011, there was this healer in Tanzania who was offering healing for a lot of children so mothers would take their children. They lost a lot of clients during that time. And then the ones that came back very spiritually dejected. So that's been kind of a question for a lot of the practitioners, like how do we even kind of talk about this or think about this, because they can't not talk about it or think about it. But there's also very little like institutional incentive to do that, right? So like if you're already spending all of your time filling out forms for USAID, you don't have a ton of time to go and talk to a pastor or to like sit down with a person who thinks that they're healed and meet with them over. But they are always making efforts to do that when they can.
What are the motivations of these pastors? Do they really believe that they're healers, that they're healing people? Are their motives a bit more less benevolent? Because
Well, it depends on who you talk to. I'm sure that some of these pastors think that they are genuinely offering healing, and I think and I've been to some of these healing churches, and there is something to the idea of like really taking someone's physical illness so seriously that you are in front of a community of people offering healing to that person. And I think that that is something that is missing even in Kenya and in a lot of the sort of mainline Protestant traditions. So there is something compelling, I think, that they're offering. I think I know a lot of Kenyans that will tell you that they're just looking for money. So they'll ask for an offering and then you will give them your healing prayers. Especially actually the one that Nancy went to, it has a reputation like that. And then, but no one's willing to say that that this healing might not work. So they say maybe not for HIV, but like there are plenty of, every single staff member I talked to had a story of being prayed for another thing that they were healed from. So HIV feels a little nefarious because, it can kill you, right, if you stop taking your medication, but at the same time, there isn't, and no one is willing to say that this can never happen. That makes sense. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But also like the deal that she was carried for connecting herself out to that spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And like feeling that I don't know, she was right for her. Saturday, like when I enjoyed her vision said about going back to
Yeah, I mean, her story is she's a kind of person that just like wears her heart on her sleeve, like which is was kind of rare from a lot of the people her age that I talked to, but she really, like, if she was having a bad day, she would tell you she was having a bad day. And she was on the heels of this really bad bout with depression. But she is, I mean, that also, when she was telling me that every time I take it, I just think that my mom has all of this faith that I don't have. I still don't really know what to make of it, other than it just feels important to say that. That this story, like, it's not always this good, neatly type, wrapped up story of I take my drugs well and I'm never sad again. It's I take my drugs well and I'm pretty sad because my mom seems to have accessed something that I can't get to. And she is very clear, she's Presbyterian. Her mom goes to this other church that's not Presbyterian. So she's really clear, like, she's like, she always talks about like probably how you guys might talk or think about it. She's like, oh, I see God when I'm with my friends or when I'm happy, and her mom sees God in these like very physical ways that she does not. And I think I know she feels kind of tormented by that. Like maybe there's something I'm missing. Yeah.
like the story you just told, how can people provide good pastoral care to people that are already marginalized in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's actually a really interesting group. You should look into them. They're what are they called though? Interrela. So this is a group of pastors. I can't remember what Interrela stands for, but this is a group of pastors that actually are living with HIV, and who are very open about their status. And they have been really helpful because they've done a lot of sort of theological work around it. And so thinking about, how to think about something like HIV through a theological lens. And so they've been really helpful in providing pastoral care. This is sort of the $1 million question for a lot of people at WAD, because they are always kind of trying to partner with pastors and get pastors to like think and talk about HIV. So for every healing pastor that talks about it, like there's a million others that don't even mention it, right? So that's one thing that people want to see happen more, is speaking about and normalizing HIV and continuing to destigmatize it, and making it safe for people, for parishioners to come forward and talk about their experiences. So it's been one big thing, which is making it more open.
It seems like as we've been talking, there's kind of like this worldwide distrust in science. Because we kind of compare like the Kenyan perspective, which we have here as well, with like the spirituality. And like, I don't have enough faith, and that's why I can't pray my HIV away. And the same thing with COVID. There's a lot of religious, backlash of either not believing in it or, thinking it's political conspiracy, all these things. And so like, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but it seems very like widespread in a lot of different facets. And I guess I'm also wondering like, how do we even begin to kind of soothe that idea?
Yeah, I think what's been so compelling for me about this particular group of people, and the thing that I struggle with the most as I write and think and just like exist as a person in the world, is that even though we say like, we might frame this as like a science versus faith, like either you go the way of faith or you go the way of science, like that's not the dilemma. So like, again, every single person I talk to said, of course there's healing. Of course they're healing from physical ailments. Here are these million things that happened to me. I mean, one, this is a practitioner in the clinic. This is a clinician, a doctor, who talked about a pregnancy, that she was pregnant and they were told that the baby had anencephaly, which meant the baby wouldn't survive outside the womb. And she went home and she prayed, and she had a vision from God, and she refused to terminate the pregnancy, and the baby was born. It was fine. Or one woman another clinician actually, so a medical doctor, who was hit by a car and was, almost died, but then was healed. And she talks about the vision she got from God in that moment. And then the other people who said things like, oh, I had diabetes and now I don't have it, so it's not that these people who are highly scientifically trained people are saying, yeah, this can absolutely happen. And also, I think you should take your medicine every day. So this whole like either or world that I think we get caught up in that was not their conundrum. That was mine. And so that's been something that I think about that a lot. And kind of like, what would it mean to actually take that part seriously, take the faith part seriously, take the miraculous part seriously, and also take the scientific part seriously, and just be able to hold them at the same time. Because I think we're just not conditioned to do that in the US, generally speaking.
It seems like Shirley's mother like really understands that though. Like even though she had this like miraculous thing, she like understands that like her daughter's experience with God is just different. And I really appreciate like the love that she shows, and not just love, but like the understanding that she has for her daughter's like own walk with God. And the way that like she still is encouraging her to like take her medicine. She was the person to get Shirley to take her medicine again, was really powerful. And I think is like that is what you're talking about. Like she was able to have this experience and to be healed, presumably, while also boundaries. While also encouraging her daughter.
Yeah, it didn't have to be all or nothing for her or for Shirley, really.
Do you think that there is a like specific reason that you could point to as to why it's that way in the US versus in Africa, in their regards to seeing this like united, not faith versus science?
I mean, I think a lot of it does go back to this idea of collective well-being, and so much of like African religious traditions and African indigenous religions is centered around the idea of healing. And it's also like African religions are notoriously flexible, meaning that they like it's easier to take on elements of other traditions, religious traditions in particular, and it doesn't compromise their practices or their beliefs that they already have. And I think that flexibility has really helped them in a lot of ways when it comes to thinking about things like healing. So, I mean, I think that's one thing. I don't just painting with broad brushstrokes. I don't think that we generally think that way. And I definitely don't think that Christianity is known for its flexibility. As a, famously monotheistic religion that says you must have one God. So this is kind of an interesting thing religiously to think about too, is like how these religious traditions that were already at work before Christianity came, it actually makes people much more open to kind of different ways of doing things. Also, there's a lot of what we talk about in African religion is it's intensely pragmatic, so it's intensely practical. So it's much less about what you might believe and much more about kind of what works. And I think that we when it comes to religion.
Is there any way to change that attitude?
I think we should be more comfortable thinking about what works. I mean, I think it's really hard to let go. I'm not saying we let go of the idea of belief altogether, but I think there is, at least within religious studies and theology, there's a tendency to denigrate things that just seem practical because it seems like there's nothing there. And I think that there is something there. And so if we kind of start acknowledging that that it's okay to be practical and that there are reasons to sort of adopt a more pragmatic, that we already actually are pragmatic about what we believe and when we believe it. So if we start kind of naming that, I think we might be a little bit more open. Can't really say that in a lot of theological circles. So. You can in anthropological ones.
All right. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Sharing your research with us. Next week, we have a guest, the visiting Steele Center scholar. Next Wednesday, the Wednesday afternoon discussion will be on evaluative pluralism and devotion. Be presented by Paul Katsifanis, who's from BU. And then there'll be a talk Thursday night at 7 p.m. in the Shell Theater on fanaticism and resentment. So please come to the Wednesday afternoon discussion next Wednesday and the talk next Thursday night. You can find it in Hendrix today. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks, guys.
So sorry.
The second thing I know. It's not a problem.
So it's wonderful. We should do that for next week.